The humble beginnings. From myth to early republic, the story of Rome is one of the greatest narratives in human history. It is a tale of ambition, resilience, innovation, and ultimately, decline. When we think of the Roman Empire, many images come to mind: mighty legions marching across Europe, grand architecture like the Colosseum, powerful emperors such as Augustus or Julius Caesar, and the sweeping legacy that shaped Western civilization. But before Rome became the empire that ruled much of the known world, it began as something far smaller, an unremarkable settlement on the banks of the Tiber River. This chapter takes us to the earliest days of Rome. We'll explore how a collection of villages grew into a kingdom, then into a republic, setting the stage for the rise of an empire. And we'll see how myths and legends blended with reality to create a national identity that guided Romans for centuries. The myth of Rome's foundation. The story of Rome's birth is legendary, quite literally. For centuries, Romans told and retold the tale of Romulus and Remus, the twin brothers who were said to have been raised by a she-wolf. According to the myth, they were the sons of Mars, the god of war, and a mortal woman named Rhea Silvia. Abandoned at birth, they were discovered and nursed by a wolf before being taken in by a shepherd. As adults, they decided to found a city. But, in a tragic twist, Romulus killed his brother Remus after a dispute. Romulus became the first king of Rome, giving his name to the city. Whether or not this tale has any factual basis, it reveals something important. Romans saw themselves as a people born of struggle, violence, and destiny. They believed their very origins were tied to the gods, and that conflict was part of their nature. The myth was not just a bedtime story. It was a cultural foundation that justified Rome's wars and its expansion. The early kings, historically, Rome likely began around the 8th century BCE as a cluster of settlements on 7 hills near the Tiber River. The fertile land and strategic location made it an attractive spot for trade and defense. Over time, these villages merged into a small city. Roman tradition holds that Rome was ruled by 7 kings during its early years. Some of these figures were probably based on real leaders, while others may have been symbolic. Among them was Numa Pompilius, remembered as a wise lawgiver who established many religious practices. Another was Tarquinius Priscus, credited with major building projects, including the early sewer system known as the Cloaca Maxima, which helped drain marshy land and allowed the city to expand. The last king, Tarquinius Superbus, often called Tarquin the Proud, is remembered as a cruel and arrogant ruler. His overthrow around 509 BCE marked the end of monarchy in Rome and the birth of the Republic. The Romans never again accepted a king. The very word rex, or king, became associated with tyranny. This deep suspicion of monarchy would shape Roman politics for centuries. The birth of the Republic. With the monarchy gone, Rome established a new system of government, the Republic. This was not a democracy in the modern sense, but it was a radical step toward shared governance. Power was distributed among different offices and assemblies. At the heart of the system were 2 consuls, elected annually, who commanded the army and led the government. The Senate, made up mostly of aristocrats from powerful families, advised the consuls and wielded significant influence. Meanwhile, assemblies allowed male citizens to vote on laws and elect officials, though in practice, the wealthy and well-connected held the most power. The Roman Republic was designed with checks and balances, reflecting the fear of a return to monarchy. By dividing authority, Romans hoped to prevent any one person from seizing absolute control. This system of governance, while imperfect, was one of Rome's greatest innovations, and centuries later, it would inspire the framers of the United States Constitution. Social divisions, patricians and plebeians. From the beginning, Roman society was divided. At the top were the patricians, wealthy landowners who traced their lineage to the city's earliest families. Below them were the plebeians, the common people, farmers, artisans, laborers, and soldiers. This division created constant tension. Plebeians resented being excluded from political power and pushed for reforms. Over time, through protests and even temporary withdrawals from the city known as secessions, they won concessions. One major victory was the creation of the office of tribune, officials elected to protect plebeian interests. Tribunes had the power to veto decisions by other magistrates, a crucial safeguard against patrician dominance. This long struggle between patricians and plebeians, known as the conflict of the orders, lasted for centuries. It gradually opened more political opportunities for ordinary Romans, though true equality was never achieved. Yet the process demonstrated Rome's ability to adapt, compromise, and reform, qualities that helped the Republic survive challenges that might have destroyed other states. The Roman army, backbone of expansion. Another key factor in Rome's rise was its military system. Unlike many ancient states that relied heavily on mercenaries, Rome's army was made up of its own citizens. Service was both a duty and a privilege. Early Roman soldiers, known as legionaries, provided their own weapons and armor, which tied military service to property ownership. The Roman army was disciplined, organized, and constantly evolving. Soldiers trained rigorously, and commanders experimented with tactics. Rome also had a remarkable ability to absorb lessons from its enemies. When confronted with superior weapons or strategies, the Romans often adopted them, refining them for their own use. Perhaps even more important was Rome's approach to conquered peoples. Rather than simply enslaving or destroying them, Rome often offered alliances, land, or even citizenship. This policy created a network of loyal allies who provided troops and resources, fueling further expansion. It was a cycle of conquest and integration that steadily increased Rome's power. Religion and daily life religion was woven into every aspect of Roman life. The Romans were deeply superstitious, believing that maintaining good relations with the gods, what they called the Pax Deorum, or peace of the gods, was essential for success. Every political decision, military campaign, or important event required religious rituals. Priests interpreted omens, and augurs studied the flight of birds to divine the gods' will. Roman religion was practical rather than spiritual. It was less about personal faith and more about communal duty. As Rome expanded, it absorbed gods and practices from other cultures, blending them into its own system. This flexibility helped create a sense of unity across diverse peoples. Daily life in early Rome was simple compared to the grandeur of later centuries. Most Romans lived in modest homes, farmed their land, and participated in local festivals. Family was central, with the paterfamilias, the male head of household, holding legal authority over his relatives. Values such as discipline, loyalty, and respect for tradition were deeply ingrained, setting the stage for greatness. By the 4th century BCE, Rome had transformed from a cluster of huts into a dynamic republic with a strong military, a flexible political system, and a culture that valued both tradition and innovation. It had survived internal struggles between classes, learned to adapt its government, and begun to expand beyond its immediate surroundings. The foundations were in place for Rome's astonishing rise. Soon, it would clash with powerful neighbors, dominate the Italian peninsula, and set its sights on distant lands. The myths of its origin, the lessons of its kings, and the institutions of the Republic all prepared Rome for its next chapter: expansion into a Mediterranean superpower. Conquering Italy and the clash with Carthage, the early Republic laid the foundation for something extraordinary. By the 4th century BCE, Rome had emerged as a promising regional power, but it was still far from being the mighty empire that would one day rule the Mediterranean. To get there, Rome had to first secure its place in Italy, and then survive a struggle with one of the greatest powers of the ancient world, Carthage. This chapter explores how Rome transitioned from a modest city-state into a rising force, uniting the Italian peninsula through resilience, military skill, and a shrewd ability to turn enemies into allies. We will then move to the epic series of conflicts known as the Punic Wars, where Rome faced off against Carthage in battles that would define its destiny. The struggle for Italy. In the early centuries of the Republic, Italy was a patchwork of peoples and cultures. The north was home to the Etruscans, an advanced civilization that had once dominated Rome itself. Central Italy contained a variety of Latin-speaking peoples, while the south was heavily influenced by Greek colonies known as Magna Graecia. Scattered throughout the mountains were warlike tribes such as the Samnites. Rome's initial challenge was survival. Its neighbors were powerful, its resources limited, and its political system still in development. But Rome had advantages: a disciplined army, a flexible system of alliances, and an unyielding determination. The Latin Wars in the 4th century BCE tested Rome's strength. At first, Rome and its Latin neighbors were allies, but tensions arose as Rome sought dominance. The decisive moment came in 338 BCE, when Rome defeated the Latin League at the Battle of Antium. Instead of simply crushing its enemies, Rome cleverly integrated them. Many Latin cities were granted citizenship or partial rights, ensuring their loyalty while strengthening Rome's manpower. This approach became a Roman hallmark: conquer, then incorporate. By extending privileges and creating a web of obligations, Rome bound the Italian peninsula together under its leadership. The Samnite Wars. The next great challenge came from the Samnites, fierce mountain warriors who lived in central and southern Italy. The Samnite Wars, spanning much of the 4th and early 3rd centuries BCE, were brutal conflicts that pushed Rome to its limits. The Samnites were skilled at guerrilla tactics, using the rugged terrain to ambush Roman forces. In 321 BCE, Rome suffered a humiliating defeat at the Caudine Forks, where an entire Roman army was trapped and forced to surrender without a fight. For many states, such a disaster would have broken morale, but Rome was different. The Republic treated defeat as a temporary setback, regrouped, and returned stronger. Over the next decades, Rome adapted its tactics, built new roads to move troops, quickly and steadily wore down the Samnites. By 290 BCE, after 3 long wars, Rome had emerged victorious. The Samnites were subdued, and Rome's control of central Italy was secure. The Pyrrhic War. Rome meets Greece. With central Italy under its sway, Rome turned its attention to the wealthy Greek colonies in the south. One city, Tarentum, resisted Roman dominance and called for help from across the sea. Their appeal brought a famous figure into Roman history, Pyrrhus of Epirus, a cousin of Alexander the Great and a brilliant military commander. In 280 BCE, Pyrrhus landed in Italy with a professional army, including fearsome war elephants. At the Battle of Heraclea, the Romans faced elephants for the first time and were defeated. Pyrrhus won again at Asculum in 279 BCE, but at a terrible cost. His army suffered so many losses that he is said to have remarked, "Another such victory, and I am undone." From this comes the phrase Pyrrhic victory, a win so costly it feels like defeat. Eventually, Pyrrhus withdrew from Italy, leaving the Romans to finish their conquest. By 272 BCE, with the fall of Tarentum, Rome controlled nearly the entire Italian peninsula. It had gone from a regional city-state to the dominant power in Italy. Rome and its Italian allies. Rome's genius was not just in fighting wars, but in managing the aftermath. Instead of ruling Italy with an iron fist, Rome built a system of alliances. Conquered cities were often granted local autonomy, required only to supply troops when called upon. Some were given Roman citizenship, binding them more closely to the Republic. This policy meant that Rome could draw on a vast pool of soldiers, far beyond its own population. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome could mobilize armies larger than any of its Mediterranean rivals. The stage was set for expansion beyond Italy's borders. Enter Carthage, the Punic Wars. Begin while Rome was consolidating Italy, another great power ruled the western Mediterranean, Carthage. Located in modern-day Tunisia, Carthage was a wealthy, maritime empire founded by Phoenician traders. Its strength lay in its navy, its trade networks, and its vast wealth. Rome and Carthage initially had friendly relations, even signing treaties of cooperation. But as Rome's influence expanded, the two powers inevitably collided. Their rivalry would spark the Punic Wars, a series of 3 conflicts that spanned over a century and changed the course of history. The First Punic War, 264–241 BCE. The first clash began in Sicily, a rich island that both Rome and Carthage coveted. In 264 BCE, a dispute between local powers drew the two giants into direct conflict. Rome, traditionally a land power, faced a major disadvantage. It had no navy to match Carthage's fleet, but in typical Roman fashion, the Republic adapted. They built hundreds of ships in just a few months, copying Carthaginian designs, but adding a unique feature: the corvus, a boarding device that allowed Roman soldiers to fight naval battles as if they were on land. With this innovation, Rome turned naval encounters into infantry brawls, where their discipline gave them the edge. After decades of struggle, Rome emerged victorious in 241 BCE. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province, a turning point that transformed the Republic into a true Mediterranean power. The Second Punic War, 218–201 BCE. Hannibal's revenge. If the First Punic War was costly, the second was legendary. At its heart stood one of history's greatest generals, Hannibal Barca of Carthage. Determined to avenge Carthage's loss, Hannibal launched an audacious plan. In 218 BCE, he led his army, including war elephants, across the Alps into Italy, a feat so daring it is still studied today. The journey was brutal, with many soldiers and animals lost, but Hannibal's boldness paid off. In Italy, he unleashed a series of devastating victories. At Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and most famously at Cannae in 216 BCE, Hannibal annihilated Roman armies, killing tens of thousands. The Battle of Cannae remains one of the greatest tactical masterpieces in military history. Rome seemed on the brink of collapse. Yet once again, the Republic's resilience shone through. Instead of surrendering, Rome refused to negotiate. They adopted a war of attrition, avoiding pitched battles with Hannibal and focusing on cutting off his supply lines. Meanwhile, a new Roman general rose to prominence: Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus. He carried the war into Spain and then directly to North Africa, forcing Hannibal to return home. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, Scipio defeated Hannibal, ending the war. Carthage was stripped of its empire, its navy, and much of its wealth. Rome now dominated the western Mediterranean. The Third Punic War, 149–146 BCE. The end of Carthage never fully recovered. Though weakened, it rebuilt some prosperity, which alarmed Roman senators who still saw it as a threat. In 149 BCE, Rome launched the Third Punic War. This final conflict was brutal and one-sided. Roman forces besieged Carthage for 3 years. When the city finally fell in 146 BCE, it was destroyed. Ancient sources claim the Romans burned the city to the ground, enslaved the survivors, and even plowed salt into the earth to ensure nothing would grow again, though the salt story may be more legend than fact. What mattered was that Carthage was no more. Rome was now undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. Rome's transformation, the Punic Wars, changed Rome forever. Victory brought vast new territories, Sicily, Sardinia, Spain, and later North Africa. Rome had become a global power, with wealth pouring in from conquests. But these wars also planted seeds of future problems. The influx of slaves and riches disrupted traditional Roman society. Wealthy elites grew richer, while small farmers struggled to compete. Political tensions began to rise, and Rome's leaders increasingly sought personal glory through military conquest. Still, at this stage, Rome's triumph seemed absolute. It had conquered Italy, defeated one of the greatest generals in history, and established itself as the dominant force in the Mediterranean. The Republic stood at the height of its power, poised to expand even further. The age of expansion, wealth, slavery, and social unrest. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, Rome had become the dominant power in the Mediterranean world. Its victories over Carthage and the conquest of vast territories had elevated the Republic into something far greater than a regional Italian power. Rome was now the center of an empire in all but name, controlling provinces from Spain to Greece, from North Africa to Asia Minor. This era brought extraordinary wealth, cultural exchange and influence, but also deep divisions and strains within Roman society. Expansion created opportunities for some while leaving others behind. The influx of slaves and treasure changed the economy, while the growth of inequality and corruption destabilized the Republic's carefully balanced political system. To understand how Rome began to unravel, we must first explore how success reshaped the Republic from the inside. The wealth of empire. After the defeat of Carthage and the annexation of new provinces, Rome was flooded with wealth. Conquered lands paid heavy tributes and taxes. Victorious generals brought home spoils of war, from gold and silver to works of art, statues, and exotic goods. For the first time in its history, Rome became a city of immense riches. The most visible sign of this wealth was the rise of an elite ruling class. Roman senators and equestrians, the wealthy business class, grew richer than ever, purchasing vast estates across Italy. They invested in trade, financed shipping ventures, and lent money at high interest to provinces under Roman control. For the aristocracy, expansion was a golden opportunity. Military command became the path to power as successful generals returned to Rome with both money and glory. A new culture of competition emerged, where ambitious politicians sought foreign wars, not only for the Republic's honor, but for personal prestige. The growth of slavery. One of the most profound changes was the explosion of slavery. Every Roman conquest brought tens of thousands of captives, many of whom were sold into slavery. By the 2nd century BCE, Italy was filled with enslaved workers, on farms, in households, in workshops, and even in the mines. Wealthy landowners used slaves to create massive estates called latifundia, displacing small farmers who could not compete. These estates grew olives, grapes, and other cash crops for export, rather than grain to feed the local population. The rural economy shifted away from small, independent farms toward large estates controlled by the elite. The human cost was immense. Slaves had no rights and lived under harsh conditions. Rebellions broke out, the most famous being the uprising led by Spartacus in the 70s BCE, but most were crushed brutally. The reliance on enslaved labor fueled economic inequality, undermined the independence of free farmers, and introduced a volatile social tension that would haunt Rome for centuries. The decline of the small farmer. In early Republican times, Rome's strength came from its citizen soldiers, independent farmers who tilled their land and served in the legions when called upon. But expansion changed this balance. Many small farmers were drafted into long military campaigns overseas, sometimes lasting years. While they fought abroad, their farms fell into neglect. On their return, they often found themselves bankrupt, unable to compete with the cheap grain imported from conquered territories or the massive production of the slave-worked estates. Dispossessed farmers flocked to Rome, seeking work or relying on public handouts. The city's population swelled, creating a restless urban class with little stake in the old republican traditions. This shift eroded the foundation of Rome's citizen army and created a new political force, the urban poor, whose support politicians would increasingly court through promises of bread and spectacle. The rise of the equestrian class alongside the senatorial aristocracy, another social group, grew in importance. The equites, or equestrian class, originally men wealthy enough to supply their own horses for cavalry service, by the 2nd century BCE, they had become Rome's entrepreneurial elite. Unlike senators, who were technically barred from direct business activities, equites engaged in trade, tax farming, and contracts with the state. They collected taxes in the provinces, built roads and temples, and managed large-scale enterprises. The equites were ambitious and wealthy, and they increasingly sought political influence. Their rise created new tensions within Roman society, as traditional senatorial elites tried to maintain their dominance, while the equestrians pushed for greater recognition. The Gracchi brothers. Reform and resistance. The growing inequality of Roman society set the stage for reformers. The most famous of these were the brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, tribunes in the late 2nd century BCE. Tiberius Gracchus, elected tribune in 133 BCE, proposed redistributing public land to the poor, aiming to restore the independence of small farmers and strengthen the citizen army. His reforms directly challenged the power of the senatorial elite. Though he gained popular support, he faced fierce opposition in the Senate. In a shocking turn, Tiberius was killed in a riot, one of the first major outbreaks of political violence in Roman history. A decade later, his younger brother Gaius continued the reformist agenda, pushing for land redistribution, subsidized grain for the poor, and greater rights for Rome's allies. He too met violent resistance, and in 121 BCE he was killed along with thousands of his supporters. The deaths of the Gracchi revealed a dangerous new reality. Political disputes in Rome were no longer resolved through debate and compromise, but through violence and intimidation. The Republic's traditions of shared governance were beginning to fracture. Roman culture and Greek influence. While Rome was grappling with social unrest, it was also absorbing the cultural riches of the wider Mediterranean. Conquests in Greece and the Hellenistic world brought an influx of art, literature, philosophy, and science. Roman elites admired Greek culture, hiring Greek tutors for their children, building libraries, and sponsoring theaters. Greek architecture influenced Roman temples and public buildings, while Greek philosophy shaped Roman thought. Stoicism, in particular, became popular among statesmen, emphasizing duty, self-control, and rational order. Yet, this cultural exchange also fueled debates. Some Romans worried that Greek luxury and sophistication were corrupting traditional Roman values of discipline, simplicity, and devotion to the state. This tension between Roman tradition and foreign influence became a recurring theme in the Republic's history. Expansion into the East. Rome's ambitions were not limited to the West. After the fall of Carthage, Rome turned its gaze eastward, where the fragmented successor states of Alexander the Great offered new opportunities. The wars against Macedonia and the Seleucid Empire in the 2nd century BCE brought Rome immense power. In Greece and Asia Minor, victories at battles like Cynocephalae, 197 BCE, and Magnesia, 190 BCE, established Rome as the arbiter of Greek affairs. By mid-century, much of the eastern Mediterranean had fallen under Roman influence, either directly or through client states. These conquests enriched Rome further, but also drew it into the complex politics of the Hellenistic world. Rome was no longer just an Italian power. It was becoming a Mediterranean empire. Corruption in the provinces. With new provinces came new problems. Governors appointed to oversee Rome's territories often abused their power, extorting money from local populations and enriching themselves at their subjects' expense. The Senate, tasked with supervising governors, rarely intervened. This corruption fueled resentment among the provinces and added to Rome's internal conflicts. Reformers like the Gracchi sought to address these abuses, but the entrenched interests of the elite made meaningful change difficult. The transformation of Roman politics by the late 2nd century BCE, the Republic was in crisis. The balance between rich and poor, between Senate and assemblies, was breaking down. Ambitious leaders began to appeal directly to the people, bypassing traditional institutions. Violence became an accepted tool of politics, and the competition for power grew ever more ruthless. At the same time, the Roman army was undergoing a transformation. Traditionally, soldiers were citizen farmers with a direct stake in the Republic. But as small farmers declined, the Republic faced a manpower shortage. The solution would come in the form of military reforms that would fundamentally reshape Rome's future and shift power from the Senate to individual generals. The Marian reforms and the rise of powerful generals, the late 2nd century BCE, was a turning point in the history of the Roman Republic. The growing inequalities between rich and poor, the disintegration of the small farming class, and the influx of slaves had left Rome facing a crisis of manpower. For centuries, the Roman legions had relied on citizen soldiers, men who owned land and could afford their own arms. But as small farmers disappeared, so too did the backbone of Rome's military. It was in this climate that a general named Gaius Marius emerged, a man whose reforms would transform the Roman army forever. His changes allowed Rome to continue, expanding, but they also unleashed forces that would destabilize the Republic. Armies became more loyal to their generals than to the state, paving the way for civil wars and the eventual rise of emperors. The rise of Gaius Marius was not a traditional aristocrat. Born in 157 BCE in the town of Arpinum, he came from a family of equestrian rank, but without the prestige of Rome's great noble houses. His career embodied Rome's belief in merit through military achievement. He rose to prominence during the war against Jugurtha, the king of Numidia in North Africa. Jugurtha had defied Rome for years through bribery, cunning, and guerrilla tactics. The Senate struggled to bring the conflict to an end, leading to frustration among the Roman people. Marius, serving as a subordinate officer, positioned himself as a champion of the common people against the corruption of the senatorial elite. In 107 BCE, he was elected consul and took command of the war. Promising quick victory, Marius embarked on a campaign that ultimately subdued Jugurtha, though the final capture was achieved by his lieutenant Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a man whose name would later be tied to one of Rome's bloodiest civil wars. The manpower crisis. Even as Rome celebrated victories abroad, it faced a dangerous shortage of soldiers. Decades of expansion, combined with long overseas campaigns, had devastated the class of small farmers who traditionally filled the ranks. Wealthy elites owned vast estates worked by slaves, but these men did not serve in the legions. Rome's military system required soldiers to meet property qualifications, ensuring they could afford armor and weapons. But by the late 2nd century BCE, fewer and fewer men qualified. The Republic faced a dilemma. Without soldiers, Rome could not maintain its empire. The Marian reforms, Marius's solution, was revolutionary. He opened military service to the capite censi, the head count. the poorest citizens who owned little or no property. For the first time, Rome's army became a professional force rather than a citizen militia. The state now provided equipment and training. Soldiers enlisted for fixed terms, often 16 years or more, and looked to their general for pay, spoils, and, most importantly, land upon retirement. This shift had profound consequences. The loyalty of soldiers began to transfer from the Republic itself to the generals who led them. In addition, Marius reorganized the structure of the legions. He standardized training and equipment, making the army more cohesive. He replaced the old manipular system with the cohort, a larger and more flexible unit of about 480 men. This change increased battlefield efficiency and gave Roman armies greater tactical strength. The Marian reforms saved Rome's military power, enabling it to continue its expansion. But they also planted the seeds of instability, as ambitious generals now commanded armies devoted to them personally, armies they could one day turn against Rome itself. The threat of the Cimbrian Teutonans, Marius's new army, soon faced its first great test. In the late 2nd century BCE, Rome was threatened by massive migrations of Germanic tribes, the Cimbri and the Teutones. These tribes swept southward into Roman territory, defeating several legions and creating panic in the Republic. In 105 BCE, at the Battle of Arausio, Rome suffered one of its worst defeats, with an estimated 80,000 soldiers killed. The disaster shook Rome to its core and created an urgent need for strong leadership. Marius, already celebrated for his victory over Jugurtha, was re-elected consul, an unprecedented 5 times in a row to deal with the crisis. Under his leadership, the Roman army was reformed, disciplined, and prepared for large-scale warfare. In 102 BCE, Marius annihilated the Teutones at the Battle of Aquae Sextiae. The following year, he crushed the Cimbri at Vercellae. These victories saved Rome from catastrophe and cemented Marius as the 3rd founder of Rome, after Romulus and Camillus. The rise of Sulla yet. Even as Marius basked in glory, a rival was emerging, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla came from a patrician family that had fallen on hard times, but he was ambitious, ruthless, and gifted as a commander. His capture of Jugurtha in 105 BCE earned him recognition, and he served under Marius in the campaigns against the Germanic tribes. Tensions between the two men grew. Marius represented the popular cause, appealing to the masses and using his prestige to win repeated consulships. Sulla, by contrast, sought the backing of the Senate and the aristocracy. Their rivalry would soon escalate into open conflict, tearing Rome apart. The Social War, 91-88 BCE. Before Marius and Sulla clashed directly, Rome faced another crisis. The Social War, named after the Socii, Rome's Italian allies. For centuries, these allies had fought alongside Rome, supplying soldiers and resources. Yet they were denied Roman citizenship, excluded from political rights, and burdened with taxes. Frustration boiled over in 91 BCE, when Rome's Italian allies revolted. The war was bitter, with heavy losses on both sides. Ultimately, Rome conceded, granting citizenship to most of the Italian allies. This decision expanded the Roman citizen body dramatically, integrating Italy more fully into the Republic. The Social War, however, had unintended consequences. It gave ambitious generals like Marius and Sulla vast new pools of manpower to draw upon, and it left the Republic weakened just as its internal divisions were reaching a breaking point. The first march on Rome, in 88 BCE, Rome declared war on King Mithridates VI of Pontus, a powerful ruler in Asia Minor who had massacred tens of thousands of Roman citizens and allies in a coordinated uprising. Command of this lucrative and prestigious campaign became a flashpoint between Marius and Sulla initially. The Senate granted command to Sulla, but Marius used his influence with the popular assemblies to have the decision overturned. Enraged, Sulla did the unthinkable. He marched his army on Rome itself, the first time in history a Roman general had turned his legions against the city. Sulla seized control, executed Marius's supporters, and reasserted his command of the Mithridatic campaign. Marius fled into exile, but the stage was set for civil war, Marius's return and the bloodshed in Rome. While Sulla departed for the east to fight Mithridates, Marius regrouped. In 87 BCE, he returned to Italy with a force of his own, joining with Lucius Cornelius Cinna, another powerful Roman politician. Together, they captured Rome. What followed was a period of brutal retribution. Marius and Cinna executed many of their political enemies in what became known as a reign of terror. Marius, now an old man, was elected consul for the 7th time in 86 BCE, but died shortly afterward. His death did not end the bloodshed. Rome had entered a new era where political disputes were settled not through debate, but through civil war and purges. The legacy of the Marian reforms, Marius's military reforms, had far-reaching consequences. On the one hand, they revitalized Rome's armies, enabling the Republic to survive threats that might otherwise have destroyed it. His victories over the Cimbri and Teutones were essential in preserving Rome's supremacy. On the other hand, by tying soldiers' loyalty to their generals rather than the state, the reforms weakened the Republic's institutions. Ambitious leaders could now use armies as instruments of personal power. The rivalry between Marius and Sulla was only the beginning. In the coming decades, other generals, Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar, would follow the same path, leading Rome deeper into civil war. Sulla's dictatorship and the weakening of the Republic, the rivalry between Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla had already spilled into open violence, and the precedent had been set. Rome's greatest danger no longer came from foreign enemies, but from its own leaders. In 88 BCE, Sulla marched his legions on Rome, a shocking violation of Roman tradition. By doing so, he had broken one of the Republic's sacred rules, that no general should bring troops within the city's sacred boundary, the Pomerium. The Republic was shaken, but worse was yet to come. The decades that followed would prove that once such a taboo was broken, it could never be fully restored. Sulla's war in the east, after securing Rome and crushing Marius's faction, Sulla sailed east to confront King Mithridates VI of Pontus. Mithridates was a brilliant and ambitious ruler who sought to expel Rome from Asia Minor and Greece. His campaign of terror in 88 BCE, known as the Asiatic Vespers, saw the massacre of perhaps 80,000 Roman citizens and allies. The Senate needed a strong commander to restore Roman prestige, and Sulla was determined to prove himself equal to the task. In Greece, Mithridates' forces held sway. Athens, long under Roman influence, had joined the Pontic king. Sulla besieged the city in 87 BCE, enduring harsh conditions as supplies dwindled. In March 86 BCE, he stormed Athens, sacking the ancient city with brutal efficiency. His legions cut down defenders and civilians alike, reducing one of the world's cultural jewels to ruins. Sulla pursued Mithridates' generals into Asia Minor, winning decisive battles at Cheronea and Orchomenus. By 85 BCE, Mithridates sued for peace, surrendering his conquests but retaining his throne. For Sulla, the campaign had brought glory, wealth, and hardened veterans loyal to him personally. Yet while he was away, Rome had fallen again into chaos. Chaos in Rome, the Cinnan regime. In Sulla's absence, power fell into the hands of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, a staunch ally of Marius. Cinna restored the influence of the populares, the faction that championed the common people, and used the assemblies to challenge senatorial dominance. When Marius returned from exile in 87 BCE, he and Cinna unleashed a bloody purge. Senators and equestrians loyal to Sulla were executed by the hundreds. Marius died soon after in 86 BCE, but Cinna remained in power, ruling Rome as consul for 4 consecutive years. His regime redistributed power and passed reforms favoring the newly enfranchised Italian citizens. Yet Cinna's dominance was fragile, propped up by violence and intimidation. By 84 BCE, he was assassinated by his own soldiers during a mutiny. When Sulla returned from the east in 83 BCE, Rome was divided, exhausted, and ripe for conquest. Sulla's second march on Rome Sulla landed in Italy with 5 legions of battle-hardened veterans. Many feared he would be overwhelmed by the forces of the populares, who still commanded large armies. Yet Sulla's skill, charisma, and ruthlessness gave him an edge. He forged alliances with powerful aristocrats, including the young Gnaeus Pompeius, Magnus, better known as Pompey, who raised his own army in support of Sulla. He also secured the loyalty of Marcus Licinius Crassus, a wealthy aristocrat who would later become one of Rome's richest men. The resulting civil war between 83 and 82 BCE was brutal. At the Battle of the Colline Gate, fought just outside Rome, Sulla secured a decisive victory. The aftermath was catastrophic for his enemies. Thousands were executed in cold blood, and their bodies displayed as a warning to others. Rome was no longer a city of laws, but a city ruled by fear. The proscriptions, to cement his power, Sulla introduced one of the most terrifying tools of political control: the proscriptions. These were public lists of enemies of the state, whose names were posted in the forum. Any citizen could kill a proscribed man with impunity and claim a portion of his property as a reward. The proscriptions unleashed a wave of violence and betrayal. Old political rivals were slaughtered, as were wealthy men whose estates could enrich Sulla's supporters. Sons betrayed fathers, slaves betrayed masters, and neighbors turned against one another. It was not only vengeance, but also greed that fueled the killings. Through the proscriptions, Sulla eliminated his opponents and enriched his allies. But the Republic paid a terrible price. Trust between citizens was shattered, and politics became a matter of survival rather than principle. Sulla as dictator in 82 BCE. Sulla declared himself dictator, reviving an office that had lain dormant for over a century. Traditionally, a dictator was appointed in times of emergency and held absolute power for 6 months. Sulla, however, extended his dictatorship indefinitely, using it as a platform to reshape the Republic. His reforms were designed to strengthen the Senate and weaken the power of the populares and the tribunes of the plebs. He expanded the Senate from 300 to 600 members, filling it with his supporters. He stripped the tribunes of their right to propose laws and barred them from holding higher office, making the position politically meaningless. By doing so, he hoped to prevent future populist leaders from undermining senatorial authority. Sulla also reorganized the courts, restoring control of juries to senators rather than equestrians, and he formalized the cursus honorum, the ladder of political offices. His intent was to restore the traditional dominance of Rome's aristocracy and prevent ambitious generals from using the assemblies to bypass senatorial control. Land confiscations and colonies. To reward his soldiers, Sulla confiscated vast tracts of land from Italian communities that had opposed him. Entire towns were dispossessed and their land redistributed to Sulla's veterans. While this policy secured loyalty from his troops, it created bitterness among those who lost their property. Many dispossessed Italians drifted into poverty or banditry, swelling the ranks of those who would later challenge Rome's order. Sulla also established colonies of veterans throughout Italy, planting seeds of discontent that would erupt in later revolts. His settlements disrupted local communities and reinforced the divide between those who had supported him and those who had suffered under his regime. The paradox of Sulla's dictatorship. Sulla's dictatorship was paradoxical. On the one hand, he ruled with absolute power, dictating laws and reshaping the state through terror. On the other hand, he insisted that his reforms were designed to restore the republic, not destroy it. Unlike later dictators, Sulla did not seek to crown himself king or establish a dynasty. In 79 BCE, astonishingly, he resigned his dictatorship and retired to private life in Campania. He declared that he had restored the republic and left Rome to govern itself under his new constitution. Few could believe such a thing was possible. He lived only a short while longer, dying in 78 BCE of natural causes. His death did not bring peace. Instead, the power vacuum he left behind invited new conflicts and ambitious leaders eager to follow the path he had blazed. The weakening of the Republic. Sulla's dictatorship weakened the Republic in several key ways. Precedent of violence. By marching on Rome twice, Sulla demonstrated that generals could seize power by force. His example would later inspire others, most famously Julius Caesar. Proscriptions, the systematic killings, created an atmosphere of fear and revenge. Politics became a deadly game where survival depended on power, not laws. Erosion of popular rights. By stripping the tribunes of their power, Sulla undermined the mechanisms that had once given voice to ordinary Romans. This fostered resentment and ensured future leaders could rally the masses against the Senate. Veteran settlements. The confiscations and resettlements destabilized Italian society, leaving deep scars that would resurface in later revolts. Temporary nature of reforms. While Sulla intended to strengthen the Senate, his reforms were quickly undone after his death. His dictatorship revealed that the Republic's institutions could be bent or broken by anyone strong enough to do. So a republic in transition. The decades following Sulla's death were marked by instability. New figures rose to prominence. Pompey, who had proven himself as Sulla's ally, Crassus, who grew wealthy from the chaos, and a young Julius Caesar, whose family ties to the Marian faction gave him a political identity opposed to Sulla's. Order. Each of these men learned from Sulla's example. They saw that an ambitious general could defy tradition, raise private armies, and dominate Rome. The Republic's foundations had been cracked, and in the coming years, those cracks would widen into deep fissures. The rise of Pompey, Crassus, and the shadow of Spartacus. The death of Lucius Cornelius Sulla in 78 BCE left the Roman Republic without its most feared strongman. Yet his shadow loomed over every political decision. He had demonstrated that a general could seize power through military force, purge enemies through terror, and then shape the state to his own liking. The Republic might have resumed its normal rhythms, but the truth was inescapable. Sulla's march on Rome had set a precedent that could never be undone. Into this uncertain world stepped a new generation of ambitious leaders, men who would learn from Sulla's example, but also outgrow it. Among them were Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, remembered as Pompey the Great, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, and a young but rising figure named Julius Caesar, whose destiny was not yet written. The stage was set for decades of rivalry, uneasy alliances, and bloody conflicts. And before these men could secure their dominance, they would face one of the most dramatic internal crises of the Republic, a massive slave uprising led by a gladiator named Spartacus, Pompey the Great. The young General Pompey's story began with privilege, but was defined by ambition. Born in 106 BCE to a prominent but not ancient family, Pompey's father, Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo, had been a successful general. Yet Strabo was hated in Rome, remembered for his cruelty and opportunism. When he died, Pompey inherited both his estates and the distrust of the Roman elite. Pompey was only in his early 20s when Sulla returned from the east in 83 BCE. Despite his youth, he raised a private army of his father's veterans, equipping them with his own wealth. He marched to join Sulla, who initially greeted him with suspicion. But Pompey's military skill and decisive victories against Sulla's enemies earned him admiration. Sulla, recognizing Pompey's talent, gave him the honorary title Magnus, the Great, though at first it may have been half in jest. Pompey embraced it fully, styling himself as a second Alexander the Great. His meteoric rise was unprecedented. By the time he was 35, Pompey would celebrate multiple triumphs, command vast territories, and become Rome's most celebrated general. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome. If Pompey embodied youthful ambition, Marcus Crassus represented ruthless pragmatism. Born in 115 BCE, Crassus came from an old aristocratic family. His father had been killed in Marius's purges, forcing Crassus into exile during those turbulent years. When Sulla seized power, Crassus returned to Rome and grew immensely wealthy by exploiting the chaos. He purchased the confiscated properties of the proscribed at bargain prices, amassing vast estates. He also built a fortune through business ventures, including silver mining and real estate. By the 70s BCE, Crassus was known as the richest man in Rome. Though his reputation for greed was legendary, Crassus craved more than wealth. He desired glory to match his riches. Yet, compared to Pompey, who won victories on the battlefield, Crassus seemed overshadowed. Their rivalry would define Roman politics for years, as each man sought supremacy. The aftermath of Sulla's dictatorship. After Sulla's death, Rome attempted to restore balance. His constitution, designed to strengthen the Senate and weaken the tribunes, quickly unraveled. In 70 BCE, Pompey and Crassus were elected consuls, despite both technically being too young or inexperienced by traditional rules. Their election alone was proof of how far the Republic's traditions had eroded. Together, they reversed many of Sulla's reforms, restoring powers to the tribunes and reshaping the courts. It was not principle that motivated them, but practicality. Both men knew that by supporting the people, they could secure greater political loyalty. The Senate, weakened and divided, could do little to resist. The slave uprising, Spartacus, while political rivalries simmered in Rome, a far more immediate threat emerged in southern Italy. In 73 BCE, at a gladiatorial school in Capua, about 70 slaves plotted an escape. They overpowered their guards, armed themselves with kitchen tools, and fled into the countryside. Their leader was a Thracian gladiator named Spartacus. At first, the Senate treated the rebellion as a minor disturbance, but Spartacus proved to be a brilliant leader. His force swelled to tens of thousands as runaway slaves and disaffected peasants flocked to his banner. What began as a desperate escape became a full-scale revolt. Spartacus's army defeated Roman forces sent against them, including Praetorian legions. For nearly 2 years, he led his followers across Italy, seeking a way to escape to freedom. His victories humiliated Rome and exposed the Republic's vulnerability. Crassus takes command. By 72 BCE, the Senate could no longer ignore the crisis. Pompey was away in Spain, quelling another rebellion led by Sertorius, a Marian loyalist. That left the responsibility of defeating Spartacus to Crassus. Crassus raised new legions and imposed brutal discipline. According to ancient sources, he revived the practice of decimation, executing 1 in every 10 soldiers in units that had shown cowardice. This cruelty instilled fear and discipline, transforming his army into a hardened force. In 71 BCE, Crassus cornered Spartacus in southern Italy. After a series of fierce battles, Spartacus was killed in combat. His body was never found, but his defeat was absolute. To strike terror into potential rebels, Crassus ordered the crucifixion of 6,000 captured slaves along the Appian Way. Their bodies displayed as a grim warning stretching for miles. Pompey's role and the rivalry deepens. Although Crassus had done the hard work of crushing Spartacus, Pompey returned from Spain just in time to intercept fleeing remnants of the slave army. He claimed credit for ending the war, overshadowing Crassus's achievements. The rivalry between the two men deepened. Both sought glory, and both believed they deserved sole credit for saving the Republic. When they returned to Rome as consuls in 70 BCE, they were outwardly allies, but inwardly competitors. Their uneasy partnership foreshadowed the fragile alliances that would define Roman politics in the years ahead. Pompey's eastern campaigns. Pompey's career reached dazzling heights after the defeat of Spartacus. In 67 BCE, he was granted extraordinary powers to clear the Mediterranean of pirates, who had grown so bold that they disrupted Rome's grain supply. Normally, such authority would provoke outrage in the Senate, but the crisis was so severe that even his rivals relented. Pompey's campaign was swift and decisive. In just 3 months, he rid the seas of piracy, restoring Rome's vital trade routes. His popularity soared. The following year, Pompey was given command against Mithridates of Pontus, Rome's old enemy. Over the next several years, he campaigned across Asia Minor, Armenia, and even into the eastern reaches of the Mediterranean. By 63 BCE, he had defeated Mithridates, annexed Syria, and established Roman dominance over Judea. His eastern conquests expanded Rome's wealth and influence dramatically, making Pompey the most celebrated general of his time. Crassus and wealth in Rome. While Pompey won glory abroad, Crassus focused on consolidating wealth at home. He financed political campaigns, bought influence, and positioned himself as a patron to ambitious younger men, including a rising figure named Julius Caesar. Crassus saw in Caesar a potential ally who could help counterbalance Pompey's dominance. Crassus's hunger for military glory, however, never disappeared. He envied Pompey's triumphs and longed for a campaign of his own that would elevate his reputation beyond mere riches. This ambition would one day lead him to a disastrous fate in the East. The shadow of Caesar amid the rivalry between Pompey and Crassus, another man quietly rose to prominence: Gaius Julius Caesar. Born in 100 BCE to a patrician family connected to the Marian faction, Caesar had survived Sulla's proscriptions only by luck and cunning. His marriage alliances and rhetorical skill earned him popularity, while his debts tied him to Crassus, who often acted as his financial backer. By the 60s BCE, Caesar had established himself as a rising star in Roman politics. Charismatic, ambitious, and daring, he understood how to appeal to the masses through games, speeches, and populist policies. Unlike Pompey and Crassus, whose rivalry divided them, Caesar possessed the skill to bring them together in a fragile alliance that would soon reshape Rome. The Republic at a crossroads. By the end of the 60s BCE, the Roman Republic was both stronger and weaker than ever. Militarily, its armies dominated the Mediterranean world. Pompey's eastern conquests had secured new provinces and immense wealth. Crassus's financial networks enriched the state and fueled Rome's economy. Yet, politically, the Republic was fractured. The Senate was increasingly sidelined, unable to control generals who commanded personal loyalty from their armies. Popular leaders appealed directly to the masses, bypassing traditional structures. The rivalry between Pompey and Crassus embodied the larger instability. Rome was too vast, too wealthy, and too divided for its old republican institutions to manage. The first triumvirate, Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. By the mid-60s BCE, the Roman Republic stood at a crossroads. Its dominion spanned from Spain to Syria, from North Africa to Asia Minor. Wealth poured into Rome, enriching the aristocracy and fueling the ambitions of generals who commanded vast armies. Yet beneath the grandeur, the Republic's institutions were faltering. The Senate was divided, the assemblies were manipulated by powerful leaders, and political violence was a regular occurrence. It was in this fragile environment that three ambitious men, Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, forged a private alliance that would dominate Roman politics for nearly a decade. Though historians would later call it the First Triumvirate, at the time it had no official name. It was not a legal office, but an understanding, three men combining their resources, wealth, and power to control the Republic for their own ends. Caesar's ambition. Julius Caesar was the youngest of the three, but his political genius made him indispensable. Born in 100 BCE to a patrician family, Caesar's early life was marked by danger. During Sulla's dictatorship, he was targeted because of his Marian connections, but managed to escape with his life. He built his career step by step, first as a priest, then as a military officer, and later as an orator and politician. By the 60s BCE, Caesar was known for his charisma and populist policies. He spent lavishly on public games and spectacles, plunging himself into debt but winning the love of the masses. He cultivated alliances with influential figures, including Crassus, who often paid off his debts. Caesar also showed an uncanny ability to read political moods, positioning himself as a champion of the people against the conservative Senate. Caesar's ultimate goal was clear. He sought a great military command that would bring him wealth, glory, and loyal soldiers. But to achieve this, he needed allies. Pompey's frustration. Pompey, meanwhile, stood at the height of his fame. After defeating Mithridates, annexing Syria, and establishing client kingdoms across the east, he returned to Italy in 62 BCE. His triumph was magnificent. Processions displayed treasures, captives, and symbols of Rome's supremacy. Few generals in Roman history had ever matched such achievements. Yet Pompey faced frustration in Rome. He sought ratification of his eastern settlements and land grants for his veterans. The Senate, however, resisted. Many senators feared Pompey's power and resented his extraordinary commands. They delayed, blocked, and undermined his proposals, leaving him politically isolated. Pompey's pride was wounded. He had given Rome vast territories, yet he was denied the respect he believed he deserved. This resentment pushed him toward an alliance with others who shared grievances against the Senate. Crassus's ambition. Marcus Crassus, for his part, had wealth beyond measure, but lacked the military glory that Pompey enjoyed. His role in suppressing Spartacus had been overshadowed by Pompey's opportunistic claim of credit. Despite his riches, Crassus yearned for recognition as Rome's equal of Pompey. Crassus's power came through money and patronage. He financed political campaigns, supported populist measures, and gained influence through loans. Many young politicians, including Caesar, depended on his backing, yet he too clashed with the Senate, which often looked down on him for the way he had profited from the prescriptions. Like Pompey, Crassus sought opportunities to expand his influence. Unlike Pompey, his methods were more subtle. His wealth could buy loyalty, but he needed allies who could deliver the political stage on which he longed to shine. The alliance forms by 60 BCE. Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus found themselves aligned. By necessity, Caesar had just completed his term as praetor and sought the consulship. He needed support to secure a major military command. Pompey wanted land for his veterans and recognition of his eastern settlements. Crassus wanted policies favorable to his financial interests and influence to match Pompey's stature. Individually, each man faced resistance from the Senate. Together, they were unstoppable. Caesar acted as the linchpin, bridging the rivalry between Pompey and Crassus. He persuaded them to set aside their differences and work together for mutual benefit. Thus was born the First Triumvirate, a partnership not enshrined in law but held together by ambition, necessity, and Caesar's political brilliance. Caesar's consulship of 59 BCE, the alliance bore fruit immediately. Caesar was elected consul for 59 BCE, despite fierce opposition from the Senate. His colleague, Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, tried to obstruct him, but Caesar ignored him, often conducting business without his co-consul present. With Pompey and Crassus's backing, Caesar pushed through a series of radical measures: land redistribution for Pompey's veterans, ratification of Pompey's eastern settlements, tax reforms favorable to Crassus and his financial allies. When the Senate resisted, Caesar bypassed them, taking his proposals directly to the popular assemblies. Violence often erupted, and Bibulus was humiliated to the point that he withdrew from public life, leaving Caesar to dominate the consulship. Caesar had delivered for Pompey and Crassus, securing their gratitude and cementing the alliance. The marriage bonds to strengthen the partnership further, Caesar arranged a marriage alliance. His daughter Julia was married to Pompey, despite the difference in their ages. The union was genuine. Unlike many political marriages, theirs was marked by real affection. Julia's presence softened Pompey and bound him more closely to Caesar. For Crassus, Caesar offered influence and the promise of shared opportunities in the future. Though Pompey and Crassus still distrusted each other, Caesar's role as mediator kept the alliance intact. Caesar in Gaul, having completed his consulship, Caesar secured the command he desired: governorship of Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum for 5 years. This position gave him military authority and access to legions he could mold into instruments of personal power. When a coalition of Gallic tribes challenged Roman influence, Caesar seized the opportunity. His campaigns in Gaul, beginning in 58 BCE, would last nearly a decade. Over time, he conquered vast territories, defeated powerful tribes such as the Helvetii and the Nervi, and even launched expeditions into Britain and across the Rhine into Germania. The conquest of Gaul transformed Caesar from a politician burdened by debt into a general of immense wealth and unrivaled popularity. His commentaries, written in clear and persuasive prose, spread his fame throughout Rome. He presented himself not only as a conqueror, but as a savior of Rome from barbarian threats. Tensions in Rome. While Caesar gained glory abroad, Pompey and Crassus remained in Rome. Their alliance held, but tensions simmered. Pompey's prestige was unmatched, yet he lacked Caesar's growing military resources. Crassus, though still fabulously wealthy, felt increasingly overshadowed by both men. The Senate, too, sought to exploit divisions. Many senators despised the triumvirate and worked to weaken it. Yet the alliance endured, renewed in 56 BCE at the Conference of Luca, where Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus reaffirmed their partnership. Caesar's command in Gaul was extended, Pompey was promised influence in Spain, and Crassus sought a military campaign in the east. Crassus's eastern ambition, Crassus's chance for glory, came in 53 BCE, when he led a campaign against the Parthian Empire, Rome's powerful eastern rival. He hoped to match Pompey's eastern conquests and Caesar's Gallic triumphs, but the campaign was disastrous. At the Battle of Carrhae, the Parthians annihilated the Roman army, using cavalry and horse archers to devastating effect. Crassus himself was killed, his body desecrated, and his head reportedly used as a prop in a Parthian play. His death ended the First Triumvirate. Without Crassus, the balance of power collapsed. Now only 2 men remained, and their rivalry would soon plunge Rome into civil war. Julia's death and Pompey's shift. The alliance weakened further when Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's beloved wife, died in childbirth in 54 BCE. Her Death removed the personal bond that had tied Pompey to Caesar. The relationship between the two men, once cooperative, grew increasingly tense. Pompey, now the senior statesman in Rome, drifted closer to the Senate's conservative faction. Caesar, still in Gaul, watched with concern. Their alliance was unraveling, and the Republic edged closer to open conflict. Caesar's Gallic Wars and the road to civil war. The death of Marcus Crassus in 53 BCE at Carrhae had shaken Rome to its core. The first triumvirate was no more, and with Julius passing, even the personal ties that had bound Caesar and Pompey together were severed. The stage was set for a contest of power between two of Rome's most formidable men. Yet before Caesar could march on Rome, he first had to secure his position in Gaul. The conquest of this vast region not only made him one of the most celebrated generals in Roman history, but also laid the foundations for the civil war that would end the Republic. The scale of Gaul. When Caesar first received his proconsular command in 58 BCE, Gaul was not a single nation, but a mosaic of tribes. Some were wealthy and sophisticated, trading with the Mediterranean world. Others were warlike and fiercely independent. The region stretched from the Pyrenees in the south to the Rhine in the north, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Alps. To Rome, it was both a land of opportunity and a constant source of danger. The tribes of Gaul were not united. Long-standing rivalries divided them, and Caesar exploited these divisions brilliantly. He would play one tribe against another, offering Rome's protection to some while unleashing his legions against others. This divide-and-conquer strategy allowed him to expand Roman control step by step, while portraying himself as a protector rather than a conqueror. The Helvetii migration. The first great test came with the Helvetii, a Celtic tribe that attempted to migrate en masse into western Gaul. Their movement threatened Rome's allies in the region, and Caesar seized the opportunity to intervene. Meeting them in battle near Bibracte, Caesar's legions decisively defeated the Helvetii, forcing the survivors to return to their homeland. This victory sent shockwaves through Gaul. Rome had shown its strength, and Caesar had announced himself as a commander of ruthless efficiency. Yet, it also marked the beginning of nearly a decade of continuous war. The Germanic threat and Ariovistus. Soon after, Caesar confronted a new menace, the Germanic king Ariovistus, who had crossed the Rhine with his warriors. Claiming land in Gaul, Ariovistus alarmed both Rome and the Gallic tribes. Caesar, presenting himself as the defender of Gallic freedom, marched against him. At the Battle of Vosges, Caesar's disciplined legions defeated Ariovistus's larger but less organized force. The Germanic king barely escaped with his life, and the Rhine once again became a boundary between Roman-controlled Gaul and the lands of Germania. This victory enhanced Caesar's reputation not only in Gaul, but also back in Rome. His commentaries depicted the campaign as a noble defense of Roman allies, though in truth, it was part of his greater ambition to build an empire that owed loyalty to him alone. The campaign against the Belgae. Caesar's next challenge came from the Belgae, a confederation of northern tribes. Fierce and determined, the Belgae posed perhaps the greatest military threat to Rome's conquest. Caesar moved swiftly, defeating them in a series of campaigns. At the Battle of the Sabis River, the Nervii nearly overwhelmed the Roman army in a surprise attack, but Caesar's leadership turned near disaster into victory. Caesar did not hesitate to highlight his own role in the triumph. His writings described how he personally rallied his men, seizing a shield and fighting at the front. Whether exaggerated or not, such accounts burnished his image as a leader who shared in the dangers of battle. The crossing into Britain By 55 BCE, Caesar had grown. Restless, having secured much of Gaul, he sought to extend his fame beyond its borders. He launched an expedition across the English Channel into Britain, a land barely known to Romans. The first campaign was limited in scope, more a demonstration of power than a conquest. The following year, Caesar returned with greater force, defeating several British tribes and demanding tribute. Though Rome would not permanently occupy Britain for another century, Caesar's expeditions added to his mystique. He was now not only a conqueror of Gaul, but also the first Roman general to set foot on the mysterious island across the sea. Building loyalty central to Caesar's success was his bond with his soldiers. Unlike many aristocratic commanders, Caesar shared hardships with his men. He marched alongside them, endured the same weather, and rewarded them generously with plunder. His legions became intensely loyal, seeing him not merely as a commander, but as their champion. This loyalty would prove decisive when civil war erupted. The soldiers of Gaul were not loyal to Rome, but to Caesar. Vercingetorix and the Great Revolt. The climax of Caesar's Gallic campaigns came in 52 BCE, when a charismatic chieftain named Vercingetorix united many tribes in a rebellion against Rome. Unlike earlier tribal leaders, Vercingetorix understood the importance of strategy and unity. He adopted scorched earth tactics, destroying villages and crops to deny Caesar's legion supplies. The decisive confrontation came at Alesia, where Vercingetorix and his forces were besieged by Caesar's army. Caesar constructed massive fortifications, building two walls, one to trap the Gauls inside and another to defend against Gallic reinforcements from outside. The battle was desperate. Waves of Gallic warriors assaulted the Roman lines, while those inside Alesia attempted to break free. For days, Caesar's men fought on two fronts. At the critical moment, Caesar himself rode into the thick of battle, rallying his troops. At last, the Gauls were crushed. Vercingetorix surrendered, reportedly placing his arms at Caesar's feet. The victory was total, and Gaul was effectively under Roman control. Caesar's political rise. While Caesar triumphed in Gaul, Pompey remained in Rome, gradually drifting into the orbit of the Senate's conservative faction. The death of Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's wife in 54 BCE, severed the strongest personal bond between them. Meanwhile, Caesar's victories made him immensely powerful. He was wealthy, adored by the masses, and backed by legions who owed him their loyalty. His commentaries, carefully crafted propaganda, ensured that his fame spread even among ordinary citizens of Rome. He portrayed himself as the defender of Rome's honor and the bringer of civilization to barbarian lands. The Senate, however, grew alarmed. Caesar's command was due to expire, and many senators feared that he would march on Rome to claim absolute power. They sought to limit him, demanding that he disband his army before standing for consulship again. Pompey and the Senate. Pompey's position was complicated. Once Caesar's ally, he now saw him as a rival. The Senate courted Pompey, offering him extraordinary commands and elevating his status as the Republic's defender. Pompey accepted, increasingly aligning with the conservative faction. The two former allies were now on a collision course. Caesar, unwilling to give up his power and risk prosecution by his enemies, refused to surrender his legions. The Senate, under Pompey's influence, declared him a public enemy if he did not comply. The Republic was spiraling towards civil war. The Rubicon, in January of 49 BCE, Caesar made his fateful choice. Standing on the banks of the Rubicon River, the boundary between his province and Italy, he faced a moment of decision. Crossing it with his army would mean war. To disobey the Senate's command was treason, but to surrender his power was political suicide. According to legend, Caesar uttered the words, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast, and led his legions across the river. It was the point of no return. The news spread like wildfire. Pompey and the Senate fled Rome, retreating south to gather forces. Caesar advanced rapidly, presenting himself as the protector of the Roman people against corrupt elites. The civil war had begun, born out of Caesar's victories in Gaul and the collapse of the First Triumvirate. Caesar and Pompey, the civil war, the Roman Republic, already weakened by decades of political violence and corruption, was now split between two men, Julius Caesar and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great. Both had been allies. Both had served Rome with distinction, but ambition and mistrust had turned them into enemies. Their rivalry was no longer a matter of speeches in the Senate or laws passed in the assemblies. It was a contest to decide the fate of Rome itself. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon River in 49 BCE, he set in motion the final collapse of the Republic. His march on Rome was swift, decisive, and terrifying to his enemies. Pompey and the Senate fled, believing that their best hope lay in regrouping in the east, where Pompey could draw on immense resources. The war that followed was not a short affair, but a sweeping conflict that stretched across the Mediterranean world, from Spain to Egypt to Greece. Caesar's march into Italy. Once Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he moved quickly. His gamble was speed. With only a single legion at first, he advanced into Italy, banking on surprise and the loyalty of the Italian towns. To his advantage, many communities remembered his generosity and the promises of land and reform. They opened their gates to him, while others hesitated to resist. Pompey and the consuls, unprepared for such rapid action, abandoned Rome without a fight, carrying with them the treasury and retreating south to Brundisium. In the capital, Caesar seized the initiative. He assured the Senate that he sought peace and protection for the Roman people, but his actions spoke louder than his words. He had taken Rome without bloodshed, yet everyone knew this was only the beginning. Pompey's strategic withdrawal, Pompey's retreat, was not cowardice, but strategy. With the support of the Senate's conservative faction, he aimed to draw Caesar into a prolonged conflict. Pompey knew that in Italy, Caesar had the advantage of speed, but in the east, Pompey could call upon vast resources, veterans from his campaigns, fleets from client kingdoms, treasure from the wealthy provinces of Asia. By withdrawing across the Adriatic, Pompey turned the war into a test of endurance. He would build overwhelming strength, while Caesar would be forced to stretch, his forces thin. Caesar in Spain. Before pursuing Pompey, Caesar turned westward to secure Spain, where Pompey's legates commanded strong forces. He understood that leaving such a threat behind would endanger his position in Italy. The campaign was swift but difficult. At the Battle of Ilerda, Caesar maneuvered skillfully, cutting off supplies and forcing the Pompeian commanders to surrender. With Spain pacified, Caesar secured one of the richest provinces of the Republic. His men admired his ability to win not only through battle, but also through clever logistics and persuasion. By the end of 49 BCE, Caesar had consolidated Italy, Spain, and Gaul under his control. His power was growing, yet Pompey remained formidable. In the east, the siege of Massilia. Meanwhile, in southern Gaul, the city of Massilia, modern-day Marseille, resisted Caesar, siding with Pompey. The siege became a symbol of the wider struggle, Caesar's forces against the traditional allies of Rome's old order. With the help of his admirals, including Decimus Brutus, Caesar's fleet defeated the Massilian navy. The city surrendered, but Caesar spared it from destruction, preferring mercy to brutality when it served his purposes. Every decision was part of a greater calculation, to win loyalty and present himself as the protector of Rome. Caesar, as dictator in Rome. Caesar was appointed dictator, a position meant for emergencies. His first dictatorship was brief, only 11 days, but significant. He used it to call elections, in which he ensured his own election as consul for 48 BCE. Then, in a calculated gesture, he resigned the dictatorship. By relinquishing power, he presented himself not as a tyrant, but as a servant of the Republic. This maneuver reinforced his image as a leader who respected tradition, even as he dismantled it piece by piece. Pompey's naval advantage as Caesar prepared to cross the Adriatic. To confront Pompey, he faced one of his greatest challenges, Pompey's navy. With fleets from Greece, Asia, and Egypt, Pompey controlled the seas, making it nearly impossible for Caesar to move his legions freely. Yet Caesar was never one to be deterred by difficulty. In a daring move, he sailed with a small force of legions across the Adriatic in the winter of 48 BCE, landing in Epirus. His crossing was dangerous and incomplete. Many of his troops and supplies remained behind, but he had established a foothold on enemy territory. The standoff in Greece. Caesar and Pompey now faced each other in Greece. Pompey had the larger army, better supplies, and naval superiority. Caesar, however, had speed, boldness, and the unshakable loyalty of his veterans. The campaigns in Greece became a series of maneuvers, with Caesar struggling to draw Pompey into battle while managing severe shortages of food. His men endured hunger, disease, and exhaustion, yet their loyalty held firm. The two armies finally clashed at Dyrrhachium, where Caesar suffered a rare setback. Pompey broke through his lines, inflicting heavy losses, yet Pompey failed to pursue the advantage. For Caesar, the defeat was painful but not fatal. His genius lay in resilience, and he quickly regrouped, preparing for another showdown. The Battle of Pharsalus. That decisive confrontation came at Pharsalus in 48 BCE. Pompey commanded a massive army, nearly double the size of Caesar's. Many in the Senate believed victory was assured. Pompey himself, though cautious, was pressured by aristocratic allies to deliver a final blow. Caesar, though outnumbered, relied on discipline and experience. Before the battle, he addressed his troops not as soldiers of fortune, but as defenders of Rome's freedom. He reminded them of their victories in Gaul, Spain, and Italy. For these veterans, the bond with Caesar was unbreakable. The battle began with the clash of cavalry on Pompey's left wing, which was intended to overwhelm Caesar's flank. But Caesar had anticipated this. He placed hidden reserves of infantry, who counterattacked and drove Pompey's cavalry into retreat. With his flank exposed, Pompey's army collapsed under the pressure of Caesar's legions. Pharsalus was a stunning victory. Despite being outnumbered, Caesar had triumphed. Pompey fled the battlefield, his hopes shattered. Pompey's flight to Egypt. Pompey fled to Egypt, seeking refuge in the court of the young king Ptolemy and Athene. Egypt was a client kingdom of Rome, and Pompey expected to be welcomed. Instead, he was betrayed. Fearing Caesar's wrath, Ptolemy's advisors decided to eliminate Pompey as a gesture of loyalty to the victor. On September 28, 48 BCE, Pompey was lured onto a small boat near the shore and murdered before he could even set foot on land. His body was left abandoned, his head sent to Caesar as a grim trophy. When Caesar arrived in Egypt and saw Pompey's severed head, he reportedly wept. Though rivals, Pompey had once been his ally, his son-in-law, and one of Rome's greatest generals. His death was not the triumph Caesar desired, but a stain on Roman honor. Caesar's arrival in Egypt plunged him into another conflict, the struggle between Ptolemy the Athene and his sister, Cleopatra VII, for control of the throne. Cleopatra, famed for her intelligence and charisma, sought Caesar's support. Their alliance was both political and personal, with Cleopatra becoming Caesar's lover and later bearing his son. Caesar intervened in the Egyptian civil war, defeating Ptolemy's forces in the Battle of the Nile. Cleopatra was restored to the throne, ruling alongside her younger brother, but with Roman backing. This episode showed that Caesar was no longer fighting only to defeat rivals in Rome. He was beginning to shape the politics of the wider Mediterranean world. Campaigns in the East Caesar's attention then turned to the east, where remnants of Pompey's supporters still resisted. In Asia Minor, he faced King Pharnaces II, son of Mithridates the Great. Caesar's victory at Zela in 47 BCE was so swift that he famously summarized it with the words veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. This phrase captured his style, rapid, decisive, and ruthless. With the East secured, he returned to Rome, where further challenges awaited. Caesar's dictatorship and assassination. Julius Caesar returned to Rome in 46 BCE as the undisputed master of the Roman world. Pompey was dead, the Senate had been humbled, and his enemies scattered or defeated. His victories had made him rich, beyond imagination, and his legions, those hardened veterans of Gaul, Spain, and Greece, were loyal to him above all else. Yet Rome was not simply awaiting a new ruler, it was a fractured state, weary from years of civil war and unsure of what Caesar's dominance would mean. Would he restore the Republic as he promised, or had Rome's centuries-old experiment in shared governance finally yielded to monarchy in all but name? Caesar the reformer, Caesar understood that power required more than military conquest. To secure his position, he needed to rebuild Rome itself, its institutions, its economy, and its sense of unity. His reforms touched nearly every aspect of Roman life. Debt relief. Years of civil war had left many citizens indebted. Caesar passed measures to restructure debts, easing the burden without cancelling them outright, which appeased both debtors and creditors. Expansion of citizenship. He granted citizenship to many communities in the provinces, extending the privileges of Rome beyond the Italian peninsula. This policy created a broader base of support, binding the provinces more closely to the center. Calendar reform. Perhaps his most enduring legacy was the reform of the Roman calendar. The old lunar system had become hopelessly misaligned. With the help of Alexandrian astronomers, Caesar introduced the Julian calendar, based on the solar year. It was more accurate and stable, and its structure would endure, with minor modifications, into modern times. Senate expansion. Caesar increased the number of senators from 600 to 900, filling the body with his supporters. This weakened the traditional aristocracy while giving him firmer control of the legislative process, colonies, and land distribution. He established colonies for veterans and the poor, resettling them in conquered territories. These colonies not only rewarded loyalty, but also helped stabilize frontier regions. The triumphs in 46 BCE, Caesar celebrated an unprecedented series of triumphs in Rome. Normally, a general was permitted a single triumph for a major victory. Caesar, however, staged 4 in succession, one for Gaul, one for Egypt, one for Pontus, and one for Africa. The processions were lavish displays of Rome's power and Caesar's glory. Prisoners were paraded, treasures displayed, and the spoils of war piled high. Yet the celebrations were not without controversy. Some Romans murmured that the spectacle bordered on arrogance, and others were troubled by the sight of defeated Romans, fellow citizens, being displayed like foreign enemies. Even so, the public adored Caesar. Bread, games, and spectacles ensured their loyalty, while his reforms promised a brighter future. The Senate, however, grew increasingly uneasy. Caesar as dictator for life. At first, Caesar's dictatorial power was granted for limited terms, 1 year, then 10. But in 44 BCE, he accepted the title of Dictator Perpetuo, or Dictator for Life. To many, this appointment was the final confirmation of their fears. The republic, they believed, was dead. Though Caesar never called himself king, the symbolism was clear. Statues of him appeared alongside those of Rome's gods. His image was placed on coins, something no Roman had dared before. Priests and officials honored him with divine titles, and his authority surpassed all law. For Caesar's supporters, these honors were a recognition of his greatness. For his enemies, they were proof that he sought to make himself a monarch. The question of monarchy, the word king, carried deep hatred in Rome. Since the expulsion of Tarquin the Proud nearly 5 centuries earlier, Romans had prided themselves on their freedom from monarchy. To many senators, Caesar's concentration of power looked dangerously close to the rule of kings. The tension came to a head during the festival of the Lupercalia in February 44 BCE. Mark Antony, Caesar's ally and loyal officer, publicly offered him a crown. Twice Caesar refused, insisting that he had no desire to be king, yet the act unsettled many. Was it a genuine refusal or a calculated gesture to test the public mood? The rumor spread quickly. Caesar wanted to be king, and Rome's ancient hatred of monarchy could not be ignored. Enemies in the Senate. Within the Senate, opposition crystallized around a group of men who called themselves the Liberators. Among them were Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus. Brutus was a man of high reputation, descended from the very Brutus who had expelled the last Roman king. Cassius, a skilled soldier, had served under Pompey but reconciled with Caesar after Pharsalus. Both had been pardoned by Caesar after opposing him in the civil war, a sign of his clemency. Yet this very mercy may have convinced them that Caesar intended to destroy the Republic. They feared that he would establish a dynasty, with himself as king and his heirs ruling after him. Their conspiracy grew, drawing in senators who, though once loyal, could not tolerate the idea of Caesar's perpetual rule. The Ides of March, the conspirators, chose a date for their act, March 15th, 44 BCE, the Ides of March. On that day, the Senate was scheduled to meet in the Theatre of Pompey, a public building that had become a venue for political gatherings. According to ancient accounts, omens warned of the coming disaster. Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, dreamed of his death and begged him not to attend. A soothsayer reportedly told him, "Beware the Ides of March." Caesar, however, dismissed these warnings, whether out of confidence, fatalism, or the belief that avoiding the Senate would show weakness. He went to the meeting. As he entered, he was surrounded by conspirators. At first, they pretended to approach with petitions. Then the attack began, the assassination. The first blow was struck by Servilius Casca, cutting Caesar in the neck. Shocked, Caesar struggled to defend himself, but more daggers followed. The foe conspirators fell upon him, each determined to strike a wound. Ancient sources vary, but some claim he received as many as 23 stab wounds. When Caesar saw Brutus among the attackers, tradition holds that he uttered the famous words, "Et tu, Brute, and you, Brutus." Whether he truly said this or not, the image endured through history. Caesar, betrayed by his friend and protégé, he fell at the base of Pompey's statue, a cruel symbol of the rivalry that had defined his rise. The dictator of Rome was dead. The aftermath in Rome. The conspirators believed they had saved the Republic. They expected the people to rally around them, grateful for the restoration of freedom. Instead, Rome was thrown into chaos. The citizens mourned Caesar, who had been generous with land, games, and reforms. They saw not a tyrant struck down, but a beloved leader murdered. His soldiers, fiercely loyal, were enraged. At Caesar's funeral, Mark Antony delivered a masterful oration. He read Caesar's will, which left gifts to the people of Rome, and displayed his bloody cloak. The crowd, overcome with grief and anger, rioted. The conspirators fled, their vision of restoring the Republic collapsing in flames. Caesar's legacy, though. Dead, Caesar's presence loomed larger than ever. His reforms had transformed Rome, and his assassination had unleashed forces that could not be contained. Instead of reviving the Republic, his murder deepened the cycle of civil war. In the years that followed, his name would be invoked by generals, politicians, and emperors. Even as his assassins proclaimed themselves liberators, Rome moved closer to monarchy. Caesar's death was not the end of his influence, but the beginning of a new chapter in Roman history. The rise of Octavian and the Second Triumvirate. When Julius Caesar's lifeless body lay at the foot of Pompey's statue on the Ides of March in 44 BCE, Rome was thrown into a storm of uncertainty. The assassins, those senators who styled themselves liberators, believed they had delivered the Republic from tyranny, but the Roman Republic was no longer the balanced system of citizen rule it had once been. It had been hollowed by decades of political violence, corruption, and civil war. The vacuum left by Caesar's death would not be filled by the Senate, but by new figures, each vying for control of Rome's destiny. At the center of this struggle stood a young man, barely 18 years old, named Gaius Octavius, Caesar's grandnephew and adopted son. His rise would reshape Roman history and mark the final collapse of the Republic, Octavian's unexpected inheritance. Octavian was not a seasoned general, nor a senator, nor even a figure of prominence in Rome. Born in 63 BCE into a relatively modest branch of the Julian clan, he had been raised primarily by his mother Atia, who was Caesar's niece. Though intelligent and ambitious, Octavian was a youth of fragile health, more noted for his sharp mind and discipline than martial prowess. When Caesar's will was read aloud after his funeral, the Roman world was stunned. Octavian had been named Caesar's adopted son and primary heir, receiving 3/4 of his vast fortune. He was also posthumously granted Caesar's name, transforming him from Gaius Octavius into Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, Octavian, the new Caesar. The inheritance was not just financial, it was symbolic. In Roman culture, adoption was a powerful act, making Octavian not only Caesar's heir, but his political successor. Yet many in Rome scoffed at the idea that this frail teenager could step into the shoes of the greatest general of the age. Octavian, however, was determined to live up to the name he had inherited. First steps toward power. Despite warnings from his family to avoid the dangerous world of Roman politics, Octavian immediately claimed his inheritance. He traveled from Apollonia, where he had been studying and preparing for military service, back to Italy. Along the way, he gathered loyal veterans and supporters who saw in him the continuation of Caesar's legacy. Arriving in Rome, Octavian quickly demonstrated political skill beyond his years. He distributed the money promised to the Roman people in Caesar's will, earning their goodwill. He cultivated relationships with Caesar's veterans, who admired the young heir's commitment to honoring their fallen commander's promises. Yet Octavian was not the only man vying for Caesar's mantle. Standing in his way was Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted lieutenant and consul in 44 BCE. Mark Antony and the struggle for control. Mark Antony was everything Octavian was not: a battle-hardened soldier, charismatic, loud, and physically imposing. He had been Caesar's right hand in the Gallic and civil wars, and many assumed he would inherit Caesar's role as leader of the Caesarian faction. At first, Antony underestimated Octavian, dismissing him as a boy with little to offer. But Octavian was patient and calculating. He courted Caesar's veterans and used his wealth to win over key political figures. Tension between the two men grew as Antony sought to consolidate power, sidelining Caesar's other allies, while Octavian quietly built his own base of support. The Senate, meanwhile, was divided. Some senators hoped Antony could be contained, while others saw in Octavian a useful tool to counterbalance him. Cicero, the great orator and statesman, famously threw his support behind Octavian, believing he could use the young heir to restore senatorial authority. He praised Octavian publicly, describing him as a godsend to the Republic, But Octavian was never anyone's tool. The road to the Second Triumvirate, by late 44 BCE, Rome was on the brink of chaos. Antony clashed with the Senate. Octavian gathered troops, and the conspirators who had killed Caesar scrambled for safety. In 43 BCE, civil war erupted again. Octavian defeated Antony's forces at the Battle of Mutina, but instead of restoring the Senate's control, he turned his army toward Rome. The Senate, caught off guard, was forced to yield. Octavian, though only 19 years old, demanded the consulship. Intimidated by his legions, the Senate had no choice but to grant it. The boy had become one of the highest magistrates in Rome. Soon after, Octavian made a surprising move. He reconciled with Antony. The two, along with Marcus Lepidus, another of Caesar's allies, formed an official alliance, the Second Triumvirate, in late 43 BCE. Unlike the informal pact of Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus years earlier, this new triumvirate was enshrined in law, giving the three men supreme authority to reorder the state. Prescriptions and the politics of blood one of the triumvir's first acts was brutal. To consolidate power and eliminate opposition, they initiated a wave of proscriptions, lists of enemies marked for execution. Those named were declared outlaws, their property confiscated, and their lives forfeit. The most famous victim was Cicero, who had once supported Octavian but had spoken too freely against Antony. His death shocked Rome, symbolizing the ruthless nature of the new regime. Families were torn apart, senators fled, and Rome was drenched once more in fear and bloodshed. The proscriptions demonstrated Octavian's cold pragmatism. Though he had been the darling of the Senate months earlier, he did not hesitate to sacrifice Cicero to cement his alliance with Antony. To Octavian, loyalty to Caesar's legacy mattered more than loyalty to the old republic. War against the liberators. With their enemies in Rome subdued, the triumvirs turned their attention to the assassins of Caesar. Brutus and Cassius had fled east, raising armies in Greece and Asia Minor. The final confrontation came in 42 BCE at the Battle of Philippi. There, Octavian and Antony led the triumviral forces against the liberators. The fighting was fierce and chaotic. Though Octavian himself fell ill and played little role on the battlefield, Antony's skill secured victory. Brutus and Cassius both took their own lives rather than be captured. The death of the liberators ended any hope of restoring the Republic. The cause of senatorial freedom had been buried alongside Brutus and Cassius. Rome now belonged to the triumvirs. Dividing the Roman world after Philippi, the triumvirate divided the Roman territories among themselves. Antony took the wealthy and strategic eastern provinces, including Greece, Asia Minor, and Egypt. Lepidus received Africa, while Octavian controlled the west, including Italy, Spain, and Gaul. For Octavian, ruling Italy was both an opportunity and a burden. He was responsible for settling tens of thousands of veterans promised land by Caesar, which meant confiscating property from Italian landowners. This policy made him deeply unpopular with many in Italy, but it also ensured the loyalty of his soldiers. Meanwhile, Antony traveled east, where he would become entangled in a partnership and romance that would reshape his destiny. Octavian versus Antony. Despite their temporary alliance, Octavian and Antony were destined to clash. Both claimed to be the true heir to Caesar's legacy, and both sought supreme power. Their differences in character and ambition only deepened the rivalry. Octavian presented himself as the defender of traditional Roman values, pious, disciplined, and devoted to stability. Antony, by contrast, embraced the wealth and luxury of the East, especially after allying himself with Cleopatra VII, the Queen of Egypt. To Octavian, Antony's relationship with Cleopatra was a political gift. He could portray Antony as a man corrupted by Eastern decadence, betraying Rome for the love of a foreign queen. It was a narrative Octavian would later wield with devastating effect. The seeds of a new struggle. By the late 40s BCE, the Second Triumvirate had achieved its immediate goals, avenging Caesar, crushing the assassins, and securing control of Rome. Yet unity was fragile. Lepidus, the weakest of the three, would soon be pushed aside. The real contest would be between Octavian in the west and Antony in the east. The Republic was dead in all but name. Rome was no longer governed by senatorial debate or checks and balances, but by the will of strongmen backed by legions. The world was waiting to see which man, Octavian or Antony, would emerge as the sole master of Rome. The final war of the Republic and the rise of Augustus, the defeat of Brutus and Cassius at Philippi in 42 BCE, had silenced the last great voices of Republican liberty. With the liberators dead, Rome belonged to the Second Triumvirate. But the alliance of Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus was one of necessity, not trust. It was only a matter of time before ambition and rivalry would dissolve their unity. In the decades that followed Caesar's assassination, Rome had been torn apart by warlords and shifting loyalties. Yet the struggle was not over. One more conflict, Rome's final civil war, would decide the fate of the Republic. It would also elevate one man above all others, Caesar's heir, Octavian, soon to be known as Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Lepidus, pushed aside of the three triumvirs, Marcus Lepidus, was always the weakest. After Philippi, he had been assigned Africa, while Antony took the wealthy east and Octavian ruled the west. But Lepidus lacked the charisma and military skill of his partners. In 36 BCE, when Sextus Pompey, the last son of Pompey the Great, challenged Octavian's control of the seas, Lepidus attempted to assert himself. Yet when Octavian defeated Sextus, Lepidus overplayed his hand, demanding Sicily as part of his reward. Octavian refused. Tensions flared, but Lepidus's troops deserted him, transferring their loyalty to Octavian. Lepidus was stripped of power, exiled, and reduced to a political non-entity. The Second Triumvirate was now effectively a duel between Octavian in the west and Antony in the east. Antony and Cleopatra. Antony had long enjoyed the wealth and prestige of Rome's eastern provinces, but his fate became intertwined with that of Cleopatra VII, the Queen of Egypt. Their alliance began as political necessity. Cleopatra had wealth, ships, and grain that Antony needed to maintain his armies. Yet the relationship soon deepened into passion. Antony fathered children with Cleopatra and established her as his partner in rule. To many Romans, this was scandalous. Cleopatra was viewed not only as a foreign monarch, but as a dangerous seductress who threatened to pull Antony away from his Roman identity. In Alexandria, Antony presented himself with Cleopatra as rulers of a Hellenistic-style empire, distributing eastern territories to their children in the so-called donations of Alexandria. He even declared Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, as the rightful heir of Caesar's legacy. To Octavian, this was a direct provocation. He would not allow Caesar's inheritance to be claimed by anyone but himself. Octavian's propaganda war. Octavian recognized that Antony's bond with Cleopatra could be used as a weapon. He launched a propaganda campaign to frame Antony as a traitor to Rome, an un-Roman man enslaved by the charms of a foreign queen. Rome was presented with a choice: loyalty to Octavian, the dutiful, disciplined Roman, or submission to Antony and Cleopatra, rulers of an Eastern court who dreamed of monarchy. Octavian carefully crafted his image as the defender of Roman tradition, portraying himself as pious, modest, and devoted to the Republic, even as he steadily concentrated power. In 32 BCE, Octavian made his boldest move. He seized Antony's will, deposited in the Temple of the Vestal Virgins, and read it aloud to the Senate and the people. The will revealed Antony's plans to leave wealth to Cleopatra's children and to be buried in Alexandria rather than Rome. Whether every detail was true or manipulated by Octavian hardly mattered. The effect was devastating. Antony was branded a traitor, Cleopatra a foreign menace, and Octavian the champion of Rome. The outbreak of the final war in 32 BCE, the Senate, under Octavian's pressure, declared war, not directly on Antony, but on Cleopatra. This was a shrewd political move. By framing the conflict as a war against a foreign queen, Octavian ensured that Romans could unite under his banner without openly acknowledging they were again at civil war. Both sides gathered immense forces. Antony and Cleopatra amassed more than 500 ships and 100,000 soldiers, while Octavian's fleet, commanded by the brilliant admiral Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, prepared to challenge them. The stage was set for the last great showdown of the Roman Republic, the Battle of Actium on September 2nd, 31 BCE. The rival forces met near Actium, a promontory on the western coast of Greece. The battle would determine the fate of Rome. Antony's fleet was powerful but unwieldy, composed of massive warships, armed for direct confrontation. Octavian's fleet, though smaller, was more maneuverable and skillfully commanded by Agrippa. For hours, the battle raged. Antony's ships struggled to break through Octavian's lines, while Agrippa used speed and tactics to outmaneuver the larger vessels. Then came the decisive moment. Cleopatra's ships, stationed at the rear, suddenly broke away and fled. Seeing this, Antony abandoned the fight and followed her with a small escort, leaving the rest of his fleet leaderless. The sight of their commander fleeing shattered morale. Octavian's fleet pressed the advantage, destroying or capturing much of Antony's navy. The Battle of Actium was a resounding victory for Octavian. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Egypt, their power broken. The end of Antony and Cleopatra. The following year, Octavian pursued Antony and Cleopatra to Alexandria. With his legions closing in, Antony attempted one last stand. Defeated, he fell on his own sword. Cleopatra, refusing to be paraded in a Roman triumph, chose her own death. Ancient accounts tell that she used a poisonous asp, though some suggest she employed a lethal mixture of drugs. However it happened, Cleopatra died at 39, ending the last great dynasty of the pharaohs. With their deaths, Egypt was annexed as a Roman province, its vast wealth flowing into Octavian's treasury. The last serious opposition to his rule was gone. Octavian as sole ruler by 30 BCE, Octavian stood alone as the unchallenged master of Rome. Unlike Caesar, he understood the importance of appearances. He avoided the title of king or dictator, instead presenting himself as the restorer of the Republic. In 27 BCE, the Senate granted him the title Augustus, meaning the revered one. It was a title of honor, not monarchy, yet it carried divine and regal undertones. Augustus skillfully balanced power, maintaining the facade of republican institutions while holding supreme control over the army, finances, and foreign policy. The Republic had not been restored, it had been transformed. Rome was now an empire in all but name, with Augustus as its first emperor. The legacy of the Republic's fall. The rise of Augustus marked the end of centuries of republican government. What had begun as a city-state governed by citizen soldiers and elected magistrates had evolved into a vast empire ruled by one man. Augustus's reign ushered in the Pax Romana, a period of relative peace and prosperity that would last for 2 centuries. Roads, aqueducts, laws, and culture flourished under imperial stability, yet this stability came at the cost of political freedom. The Senate remained, but it was a shadow of its former self, subservient to the emperor's will. The ideals of the Republic, shared governance, rotation of office, and checks on power were gone. In their place stood an empire that would endure for centuries, shaping the history of Europe, the Mediterranean, and beyond. The circle completed. The story of the Roman Republic's rise and fall is one of ambition, conflict, and transformation. From the overthrow of kings in 509 BCE to the assassination of Caesar in 44 BCE, Romans fought to preserve a system of shared power. Yet the very qualities that made Rome strong, its competitive politics, its ambitious leaders, its hunger for conquest, ultimately tore the Republic apart. Octavian's victory at Actium and his rise as Augustus completed the cycle. The Republic had fallen, but Rome had not. Instead, it entered a new chapter, one that would see it dominate the ancient world for centuries to come.